Let me tell you that for about 2 decades, my mentors, my students, my colleagues and I have been trying to understand how individuals, families, communities all adapt to living with a serious or chronic physical illness. So what I've really done through this program of research that I'm going to talk with you about today is try to sharpen our notion of what is context and how does it influence and how does it optimize people's adaptation to illness and all the chronic life strains that come with it. So what I'm going to do today is start off by presenting a very general theoretical framework that I work within, then give you a couple of examples of research from that framework, and then if we have enough time, and I am from New York, so I talk incredibly quickly, then I'm going to do the very grandiose thing of questioning, really, why I think my own field of health psychology for the past 30 years has failed to pay attention to context despite my repeated editorials. I'm now becoming a thorn in their side. I think we could all agree that a plea for including context has a very long history in psychology, starting with Henry Murray and Kurt Lewin. And even if we talk about the beginning of health psychology, it started with the biopsychosocial model, the idea that biological, social, and psychological processes all intertwine. That seems to scream for context. But what seems to have happened over 30 years in health psychology is that it sort of has continued the tradition of psychology of stressing individual level experiences rather than trying to understand what happens when individuals live, or the fact that they do live within social contexts. My contextual approach sort of posits that health, illness, and health behaviors are always the result of reciprocal relationships between persons and the context in which they live. So this perspective recognizes that health and illness is not the product of any single underlying factor, the kind of thing that social psychologists love to do, find the one causal factor. This is completely opposite that. It's going to argue that we're really going to understand illness and health behavior processes only when we think about multiple interacting causative factors from persons and environments. So what I created many years ago was a conceptual framework that talks about multiple domains of context and incorporates multiple levels of analysis. I originally developed this to try to show how context was really critical for understanding how personality factors affected disease. But it's, in the 20 years since I developed it, it's been used to understand how people with, who are HIV positive decide to get tested, looking at treatment adherence for breast cancer survivors, looking at families where the kids have a chronic illness. So one can really adapt it many ways. There are 3 principles around this that I want to note for you. The first one, as you look at this, is you should see that health behavior phenomena are embedded in multiple contexts or ecological niches. And that this is really a set of interdependent systems. Here I've put coping and illness in the middle because that's what I'm going to talk about today. But you really see that they're interdependent systems that at this point I've labeled the social, situational, temporal, and sociocultural contexts. Second, I want you to understand that these contextual domains are in constant dynamic interaction with each other, which is why I originally drew it as an atom, and then my student John Rendina said, it's got to move. And this is what he did, but I get sort of nauseous looking at it, so I'm going to go back to the other one. But what I want you to see is that, again, it's emphasizing reciprocal interacting relationships. So in some sense, we don't really want to isolate only one context. Third, I want you to understand, and this is the tough one I've been fighting with for a long time, contextual variables really aren't attributes of individuals or attributes of environments, but they're really about the interaction between individuals and social systems they live in. So I always think a very good example from health psychology or medical sociology is the concept of the patient-physician relationship. It's not just about the patient. It's not just about the physician. It's about the way they interact together, about levels of power, about who starts an interaction. That's really much more of a contextual variable than either of the other 2. And let me add one caveat so you don't ever think you could apply SEM to this. This is a real, what I call deep structure conceptual framework. It is not a testable model. We do not put scales in here and look at their intercorrelations. So today I'm going to focus on two of the contexts, the social context and the sociocultural context. The social context, let's think of as encompassing the full spectrum of an individual's social world. So we could talk about social support from friends and family. We could talk about interactions with formal helping systems, with social work systems, with medical professionals. And we can also talk about the fact that you don't have to be aware that this social context is around you. So a parent's stresses at work may affect a child's health, and the child may not be aware of the parent's stresses at work. Or we now know that cancer patients gain a lot of information from online support groups and social media, but they may never meet those people. So we have to really think broadly when we think about the social context. Now, I'm using this one as an example, not just because I've done research in it, but this is the context I think that health psychology has done its best job with. There are tons and tons of articles on social support, social networks. What helps, what doesn't help, how do families play a role in treatment decisions. It just goes on and on. One of my students in the 80s referred to the journal Health Psychology as the Journal of Social Support. So for a while, that's all anybody was doing. And I think it's so important to health psychology because in an annual review article that Shelley Taylor, Rena Rapetti, and Teresa Seaman wrote, they talked about social environments as getting under the skin. Because we have data that shows that social relationships really do affect physical health as well as mental health, the immune system, endocrine system, and other things. And social networks can serve as resistance resources. So it really is something that does get under the skin. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about research in this area. So I'd say over the past 3 decades, here are the big questions that have been asked. So why are close relationships important? What are the pathways linking relationships to physical and mental health? What kinds of social interactions matter? And then it sort of turned over to, maybe all support isn't good. Maybe, there's a little too much. There's not what you need. And I'm going to talk about that because that was a huge line of research that I did early on in my career. So what I've really focused on, so I'm going to narrow it in a bit, I've been looking at these questions, but with a particular population. This is people and families who are living with a chronic illness. And for the past decade, very much looking at couples as a social context. So I'm sure you've all had stuff about social support in one of your health behavior courses. For years, people were obsessing about what were the types of support, and no matter what you do, you sort of come out with these types. People give you emotional support. They show you're cared and valued. They give you information. They give you help. They give you practical help, what's called instrumental or tangible support. By using this kind of topology, people were able to say, why does social support work? Well, it's coping assistance. It helps you, the individual help, or for me, it helps the ill individual cope with the illness. And again, if we want to go over thousands of studies, this is basically what you find. More is better. It's better to have friends. It's better not to be socially isolated. It's better to get help when you're suffering at times of crisis. However, we now know that not all support acts this way. And in an early longitudinal study I did of women with newly dosed rheumatoid arthritis, I noticed that the patients talked about the things that their support providers, whether it was a spouse, a parent, a child, a neighbor, a best friend, they would say, well, they really think they're helping me, but I didn't really find it very helpful. So with one of my students from long ago, who's now a tenured chair of a department, Debbie Meyerowitz, we did a study. We went to the partners of these women to find out what it was that they felt was helpful or unhelpful that they did, and paired that with the women's words. And basically we found, okay, so all support isn't helpful. You can have your coping criticized. People are always telling you things that they don't know or don't want to know. They don't want to talk about it. It's just too upsetting to talk about. People promise you things, they walk away, and they treat you like a baby when you have a chronic illness. So they're sort of an over-giving of support. What I did was I ended up calling this problematic support, because when I first called it negative support, everybody would write in reviews for articles, you can't have negative support. Support is good. Support is helpful. So I changed it to problematic support. But I became more interested not just in problematic support, but how do they go hand in hand, problematic and positive support? Oops, let me back up on that one, or not. So what I did was I asked women in another study. This is the one that was the Allegrante era at HSS. And I looked at couples, I looked at women and their partners, and I asked the women to describe their close social networks and to what degree each person in their network provided emotional, instrumental, and informational support when they were in pain or they were having a flare of arthritis. So it was really at a time where I thought they might need some help or support. And then I looked at the association between the support they were receiving and symptoms of depression and also functional ability. And this was, as I said, a longitudinal study. And what we found was that many of the same people that you name in your network are both giving you positive support and problematic support at the same time. What we did find was, just as predicted, that positive support was related to lower depression and greater functional ability. Negative or problematic support was related to, just as it should. And this was true in both cross-sectional and longitudinal analyses, controlling for how severe the disease was, how much pain they were in. But what fascinated me was not those results, but a statistical interaction that I've pictured here. And if you look at, so what I want you to look at, the dotted line, the very flat dotted line first. These are patients who said, I get a lot of good stuff, a lot of goodies from my network. It didn't make a difference if they also said, but these people drive me crazy. So if you get a lot of positive support, it didn't really matter if people criticized you, if people didn't come through, because you had the support coming through. But look at the solid line. These are the people who say, I get very little positive support from my network. And when we look at that and then we say, well, what about when you're also getting a lot of negatives? That's the dot, the point at the end. Those people are much higher in depression, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, and when controlling for disability status and pain. That what we're finding is when you're getting the positives but also the negatives, they sort of, the problematic support has stronger effects. If you're really getting a lot of negative stuff, it doesn't work unless you also get the positives. So this really started to make me think you have to look at these things together, not just the fact that they're the same people, but that we have to really look at the resources are coming through. I called this effect the double-edged sword, because I felt what happens is your interactions with the same people in your close network both help you but can hinder you at the same time. Now, these data were all from the patient's perspective. Again, individual psychology. What about their partners? What did the partners think about this? So I did a number of studies with partners, and again using rheumatoid arthritis as the disease, because it really unleashes multiple stressors. It's not life-threatening, but it can really kill your daily life. And it has a cycle. I wrote in one grant that they thought interesting language. I said it's a great disease to study because you feel great one day or 1 week and not good the next. And you're living with this for the rest of your life. So what we found is asking the partners, so what's stressful for them? We found a number of stressors, going from very instrumental support tasks like day-to-day caregiving, informational tasks like helping with treatment decisions. But we also found that they felt really bad when they couldn't help their partner, when they felt helpless, and that it affected their day-to-day life, that they had to take on other tasks, ones that sometimes weren't gender congruent, like picking up the kids. There was often reduced sexual desire. Nobody talked about that. No doctors talked about that with them. And a number of them started to question whether their marriage was actually strong enough to get through this illness. So this is just one study, and we have many more now that shows that sometimes the stressor of an illness is harder on the partner than the patient. Because in some ways we can say the partner occupies a dual role. They're the major support provider for the patient, but at the same time they're sort of living with this illness as well, and they're expected to provide support, so who supports the supporter? So it makes some sense that their levels of depression and anxiety are often higher. Let me actually skip through a couple of things. So I started to say, looking at the partners, looking at the patients, I have to look at them together. So here's a shameless plug for a book that I did in 2005, which is the first book that really says we need to start looking at couples coping with stress. It's an edited volume. It's not all my writing. It was really time to start talking about dyadic coping, is what we call it. So let me tell you, broadly cast, dyadic coping recognizes mutuality and interdependence in coping responses to a specific shared stressor, okay? So the idea is that it's interpersonal coping and it's a shared stressor. It's not yours and I react to it, that we sort of deal with it together. The construct of dyadic coping goes beyond social support, though quite honestly, social support transactions are part of dyadic coping. But it really goes closer to how do they work as a team to negotiate the stresses and end up in the place they want to end up in terms of adjusting to the illness. I have a good colleague, my co-editor of that book, Karen Kaiser, who talks about we coping, W-E, not O-U-I. We coping, where you can really tell, she's a therapist, and she can really tell when couples come in if they're really seeing it as our illness versus his illness or her illness. Okay. Not going to do this study today, but this is the one, John, that was funded. This was the first study I did of couples using a dyadic model, looking at 113 heterosexual married couples. And what we found in general was that similarity in couples coping, or what I called congruence, was related to better adaptation. Congruence either being we use similar coping strategies, or like a puzzle, we use complementary ones and they fit together. And let me tell you about one of the clusters in this study. This was called effortful partnerships. And these are couples where they're both doing a whole slew of coping. They're pulling every trick out of their bag. They're doing lots and lots of coping together, but there's still high levels of depression. Now, in a normal correlational study, you would go, coping doesn't work. But if you look at it dyadically, what we actually saw was those partners reported less caregiver burden. Both partners reported more personal growth. And so there were positives as well as negatives. So I use this cartoon. They're coping like hell. They're knocking everything down in the room, but they're doing it as a team. I'm going to talk to you in more detail about, now I'm skipping like 4 studies later. This is a more recent study that I did with my colleague Hoda Bader at Mount Sinai about dyadic coping with metastatic breast cancer patients, okay? And this one's different than the previous one because dyadic coping has now moved to where we're not just looking at individual level outcomes, we're looking at outcomes on the level of the dyad. And as someone pointed out to me a couple of years ago when I gave this talk, and this is only possible now because we have HLM, that when I started doing this couples research, our statistics really couldn't do the couple stuff. And now, I can tell you as an editor, if you don't use HLM, you can't get a couple study published. So look how far in 10 years everything has just switched. We used Guy Bodenmans, the third co-editor of that book, my Swiss colleague, his dyadic model, which is called the systemic transactional model. Many German papers, many papers in English. And it involves multiple interactive components. What this model says is that the couple, one member of the couple has to make a stress communication to the other. So someone has to say, something's not great here. So you have the degree to which partners communicate their own stress to each other, the degree to which partners respond to that stress communication in either and or supportive and or unsupportive ways, and then past that support, the degree to which both partners cope together to manage that dyadic stress, and what I'm going to call for now, restore a sense of balance to their relationship. So it's not only that the person feels better, it's also that the marriage is doing better or the relationship is doing better. We did this in a sample of 191 couples where the woman had just received a diagnosis of metastatic breast cancer, so it's a recurrence. We had them complete questionnaires separately, spouses and partners, 3 times. when they started the treatment for the recurrence, 3 months later and 6 months later, most of these patients don't live past 2 years. So this was, by necessity, a short-term longitudinal study. What makes it easier to report this is because all the breast cancer patients are women, I can actually use him and her, which is always tough with arthritis. And this is what I'm going to call, unfortunately, very often the typical New York City cancer sample, breast cancer sample of women in their mid-50s who are white and well-educated. Something that no matter what the demographics of our city are, I see my own work as well, you try very hard and you end up with a much less diverse sample, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this because I want to make sure I get to the other studies. Basically, though, there's individual and dyadic outcomes. Think of dyadic adjustment as sort of a marital satisfaction measure. We have measures of supportive coping from each partner. And then I chose 2 measures of coping from Guy's model. Collaborative coping, which we can think of as more positive dyadic coping, where they are working as a team together, and mutual avoidance, where they are just both agreeing, we don't want to deal with this together, and walk away from each other. And if anybody has questions about the measures, I can tell you. The analyses, which were HLM, though I'm presenting them in sort of what looks like regression, is because they were entered in steps as well, so you can get a sense of how we can partial out variance. We did control for the length of the relationship and for the degree of cancer-related stress communication, because that was related to some of the outcomes. If someone really says, I am falling apart, I need your help tonight, or just said, oh, it wasn't a great day. So we did sort of control for that. And social role is the dichotomous variable, are they the patient or are they the partner? So we can look at some interactions in there as well. So we use multi-level modeling. So we could examine a number of predictor variables, how they affect the outcome over time, and also acknowledge that the patient and the partner effects are not independent from each other. Okay, I'm going to run through these fast because they're similar. So I'll go slow with the first slide. So here we're looking at the variables predicting individual cancer-related distress that both the patient and the partner filled out. So I'm still individual level outcome here. Anything significant is in bold. The arrows tell you the direction of the relationship. So here we found that when it comes to cancer-related distress, unsupportive, or what I called before problematic support, is related in the way we think. It's related to greater distress. Patients reported greater distress than did their partners, interestingly. The last step, meaning we've now controlled for all the other stuff, looking at collaborative coping. Let's look at each coping strategy separately. See the arrows go in opposite directions? Not predicted. So what we find actually is that engaging in collaborative coping affected the partners and the patients differently. Patients who said the marriages were using more collaborative coping, the patients in those marriages reported greater distress. Should have been less, right? Okay. The partners were confirming predictions, less distress. I'll get back to that in a moment, and that's the only strange finding in this. When we look at avoidance coping, we see it's acting in the predicted direction. It's related to greater distress for both patients and partners. Now let's move up a level to dyadic outcomes. We see, again, being a partner versus a patient has a main effect here, which I'm not remembering. Patients had poorer dyadic adjustment than partners, meaning they were less satisfied with their marriages. Again, the amount of cancer-related stress communication is related to dyadic adjustment. So this is a key piece I'm not going to talk about as much, but clearly any therapists, any counselors out there, we need to talk about people being able to disclose and being able to share the things that they're struggling with their intimate social network. We find that both supportive and non-supportive coping, giving support, good and bad, is related to marital satisfaction, to dyadic adjustment in the predicted directions. And when we look at collaborative coping at the end of this whole thing, we see it is related to better dyadic adjustment, mutual avoidance coping, worse adjustment. So we have significant and strong effects for these types of coping even above and beyond providing support, even above and beyond how much they communicate, the length of their marriage, that sort of thing. So what do we conclude from this? I make 3 conclusions, I think. One is that positive dyadic coping, coping as a team, coping collaboratively, which involves problem solving, planning, discussing the problem, dealing with when you disagreed on things. This is beneficial for couples coping with a chronic illness. The fact that collaborative coping requires both partners to actively participate together may sort of help us understand that slight increase in patient's distress that I said was the one thing that was really counter to predictions. Our ideas are, and maybe you'll have some other ones, is that helping a partner cope might be extremely taxing for a metastatic breast cancer patient who's already experiencing a high degree of physical symptoms, distress, fear of the future. If you're talking about patients who are already distressed, it may be that engaging in coping and trying to calm the other person down and help the other person maybe feel somewhat overwhelming. Now again, this was only 6 months. It may be that over time it can help future coping, but we're thinking that it's not really just engaging in the game, it's sort of really taking care of the other person at the same time. That's sort of this notion of protective buffering that sometimes partners go through where they don't want the patient to know how upset they are. The second thing is that we're also seeing partners may be experiencing greater stress than we imagine. I can tell you that partners communicated their stress to the patient less often. They rated the patient as being less supportive to them. They were less likely to ask for support from the patient. So here again, this notion of protective buffering. I'm suffering because I want to help you. I can't. I'm trying to protect you. The last thing you have to deal with is my distress. But when we look at that other result, we say, they're sensing it. Something's going on here. The patient is still distressed. This protection stuff, not working. So again, this notion of coping as a dyad seems to be critical. I want to make sure I stick with the time. So let me move on. Let me go back to the model and talk about some research in the sociocultural context. And the older I get, the more I begin to think this is really the critical context, that if I were to redraw this, and I might do this, it would be sort of over all the others, because sociocultural factors affect the way you define social relationships and interactions. They define situational kinds of factors, the way you think about things in shorter or long term. So I think if I could, I may have to let go of the atom at some point and make a mushroom or something. I'm debating this at this point. But I think what people think, feel, and do about their health really is situated in a deeper sociocultural context, and we don't always look at this. We ascribe demographic characteristics, but do we think about what those demographic characteristics mean? So in its most basic essence, when I'm talking about the sociocultural context, yes, it's very often referring to molar variables like age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. But really, these markers serve as proxy variables that reflect health-promoting or health-damaging processes. They tell us about culturally accepted modes of coping, and they also place boundaries around coping. But really, on a more complex level, I think the elements of the sociocultural context that we find in most articles we read really translate into how these variables are expressed in our society. So ageism, sexism, heterosexism, which we seldom study, poverty, racism, and anti-immigration policies. This is sort of a context of coping with health problems that we may only think of in very simple terms about group comparisons and not how these things are coming through society. Today I'm going to focus on race, ethnicity, and racism, just to pick one. I think that ethnic group membership is really a marker for a whole lot of non-observable psychological processes: self-identity, labeling by others, group pride, history, stigma, and a lifelong experience of discrimination. In the US at least, and we know other countries too, but here, race is very much embedded in a socio-historical context that's been colored, that's a bad word to use, dominated by unequal power and unfair treatment. So I don't ever want us to think about race and ethnicity as biological variables or even individual difference markers, but really as these kinds of processes and markers that lead to differential exposure or vulnerability to risk factors and resilience resources for health. And I think that our colleagues over on the other side of campus, sociologists Bruce Link and Joe Phelan, would really label race here as one of their fundamental causes of illness. Because what it does is it influences all kinds of proximal mechanisms we could think of in terms of health behaviors, risk behaviors, neighborhoods, crime statistics, that we're really thinking about where is it situated in our country. We know when medical discoveries come out, they're not accessible to all. We know from reading lots of New York Times articles this month in terms of the cost of certain drugs or the availability of certain treatments. And as Link and Phelan say, even if we identify and modify a mediating risk variable like smoking, for example, we're still not going to escape that fundamental cause because even if we wiped out smoking, there would be other things in terms of quality of life that might lead to poorer health outcomes. So we have to go all the way back and really think about the beginning, not just the smaller things. So I'm going to argue in some sense, no matter what the mediating mechanism, people in disadvantaged circumstances have fewer resources to cope with risk factors and to minimize their risk. And I use the word people now, and a lot of my writing I also talk about environments. I've written more about risky environments and resilient environments than people, so I have to correct myself there. I think the concept of racism can structure and inform our understanding of racial disparities in health. So when I talk about racism today, I'm talking about negative attitudes and beliefs toward ethnic minority groups, prejudice, and I'm also talking about differential treatment of groups, discrimination. I think it's through these processes of prejudice and discrimination, and as we know from research, even the perception of discrimination or prejudice. It doesn't have to happen, it's waiting for it to happen, or past experiences that are making one more vigilant, that racism produces its negative effects on physical health. And a recent survey in the US reported that at least 60% of African Americans in the United States say they are exposed to racism on a daily basis. So we're talking about a chronic stress, a repetitive stress, persistent stress. We're not talking about a stressful life event that happens once a year. So here I want to ask today with some data, how does racism play out in concrete terms? Or in Shelley Taylor's words, how does it get under one's skin? So back in 1999, Rodney Clark and his colleagues proposed a theoretical framework for how racism and racial disparities might be able to work through stress and coping theory. So I am sticking with sort of the same concepts I did before. They argued that exposure to racism can be thought of as exposure to chronic stress, and that this may be responsible for some of the risk for cardiovascular disease in African American populations, and they actually go through it biologically in terms of processes in autonomic modulation. I'm not going down to that biological level today. But I want to give you an example from a study I did with one of your former TC faculty, Steve Lepore, that we did before he left here. We got to get him back. And we examine whether racial stress contributes to cardiovascular reactivity, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Specifically, we were interested in whether black and white women, and we had many different other groups in this study, but I just want to give you this one today, might exhibit differential responses to social stressors that have a different meaning. So this perception, that's just a lousy slide. Don't have to turn the lights off more. It'll get better. So the idea is it's not just what's happening, it's differential perceptions as well that are affecting it. Because of their history of mistreatment and discrimination, we hypothesized that black women would be more likely than white women to identify negative interpersonal interactions as motivated by racial bias. So they would appraise certain racial events as more stressful. So here's the basic study design. It was an experiment. It was actually my first experiment ever, and it was late in my career, where we did 3 speech stressor conditions that we pre-tested and pre-tested and pre-tested. So we had what we called the racial stressor, which was a shoplifting stressor, which was in Bloomingdale's, basically, and that's a guard simply sort of takes you by the elbow and moves you off into a private room. Doesn't say anything, just moves you off and says to wait there. Airport delay, which is you've shown up at the airport for your 1-week vacation trip, the flight's been canceled, they're not giving you a hotel room, you're going to lose a day, you've prepaid the package. And then the control condition that was supposed to be no stress was giving a tour of a campus. We pre-tested these a lot. I'll give you one little thing that happened was, this was in 2001, 9/11 happened in the middle of data collection. So the airport stress is no longer not a racial stressor. So we actually got an extra grant to be able to follow up and test whether people who did it pre or post 9/11 were different, and they weren't. But I was hysterical for a good 6 months, I'd say, at that point. What it was is, as we now know now that we didn't know then, was it was a different racial and ethnic group that was being discriminated and treated badly at airports. So it was interesting, but it's one of those things that's in your first year methods text. The famous history effect was happening to us, but it didn't affect anything. Our outcomes were cardiovascular reactivity, meaning the soaring up of diastolic and systolic blood pressure and heart rate. And also we looked at cardiovascular recovery. So it's not just, and I'm like this all the time, so how fast your blood pressure goes up, but how long it takes to go down, because the longer it takes to go back is also damaging the arterial wall. So we looked at both of those. And our hypothesis, again, cardiovascular reactivity among black women will be higher and recovery slower than for white women. We're comparing in response to a social stressor that could be construed as racist as compared to a non-racist stressor. And then we also controlled for the campus tour baseline kind of thing, and we controlled for all kinds of baseline measurements. So we were very conservative in the way we did the analyses, which you truly don't want to look at here. So let me just give you the results quickly. I did it easy to see. This is what I call the squint and see it mode of data analysis. That yes, with comparing the racial stressor to the non-racial stressor, black women had a much higher diastolic blood pressure reactivity, higher systolic blood pressure reactivity. Wasn't a significant difference in heart rate. They're also in systolic recovery. And there was also patterns for the other two, for diastolic recovery and heart rate recovery, but they weren't significant. So we do have a pattern there. So we did see a pattern of much higher reactivity and slower recovery in response to the racial stressor than the non-racial stressor among black women. But the question is never just to compare two groups. I teach a course in health disparities at CUNY, and I always say, this isn't about group comparisons, it's about the mediator. It's about why, what's going on, what would explain the group difference. So we also said, let's analyze the women's speech content. They had been exposed to this stressor and then been asked to talk for 3 minutes about how they felt, what they believed, what they thought was going on. And so we did a textual analysis of what the women said. Not surprisingly, more of the black women than white women mentioned race for a reason, for being singled out for shoplifting. About half of the black participants mentioned race. How many of the white participants did? None, exactly. 0, okay? Not an issue. And then in fact, when I did some sort of snooping, which didn't go into the article because you're not allowed to do that, Steve is a very clean researcher, but what was interesting to me, I've never been able to write this up, is that a lot of the white women talked about embarrassment. This is wrong. This couldn't be happening to me. They wouldn't pull me in. So there was a privilege there that also came through. That was interesting in the white women, not the black women. Okay. We then said, let's look at the sample of black women and let's compare those who do make some attribution to race, prejudice, discrimination, my skin color, versus those that don't. And what we find here is, again, among the women who were very clear to say, it's because I'm black, it's because of this, had higher, I just have the systolic here, but they had higher systolic and diastolic blood pressure reactivity than the white women, and slower recovery. So again, it is about perceiving, even in what you could call as not totally ambiguous, but they didn't say why they were doing it. People are making attributions toward racism because this is something that is experienced by themselves. We also asked, had others in their family or friends experienced it? So people had had large amounts of experience with it. So taken together with many other huge population studies and other studies of cardiovascular risk and racism, our findings, along with the others, really support the notion that social situations that could be construed as racist can result in greater and more prolonged physical stress that can lead to arterial damage, that can lead to cardiovascular disease. In situations where racism is an element versus those situations where it is not. So over time, sort of repeated and sustained experience of these kinds of situations could be increasing why we see an increased risk for cardiovascular disease among black women. And this is, I just love these words of one of the participants, because this to me is the essence. There's a kind of a stress, like you're gunning your cardiovascular engine constantly if you're black, that results from dealing with people who are underestimating you, limiting your options. It results from little things like going to a store, and if there are two people at the counter, one black and one white, the white person will be approached first. That gunning the engine is so powerful to me because when we think of physiological systems, we know from chronic stress theory, from Bruce McEwen's allostatic load theory, when you are constantly in this fight or flight response, when you're constantly with all these raised indicators, that's where you're creating the damage to all kinds of physiological systems. It's not one shot of stress one day. It's the constant chronic stress. So I think we really, as health psychologists, have to start looking at these kinds of stressors much more. So why doesn't health psychology devote more attention to context? Okay? I think it's obvious to me, but it's not. So I've been dealing with this. So just so you know, while you do change areas a bit, you sometimes stay with these thorny questions for your whole career. And I think for the 30 years, I can take it back to my postdoc, but I can even find some mouthing off I did in grad school. I found my comp exam, never a good thing to find. And handwritten, I'm that old. But where I actually think I started to develop this contextual approach in some sense, it was bothering me. And some of it bothered me because I hung out with very experimental social psychologists who so completely ignored context. They were doing all their studies where they'd make fake groups and see how they interacted. And I'd say, oh, this would be interesting for aging. This would be interesting. And they'd go, you know, we don't do that. And I think I started it there. But I feel despite the fact that we started with the biopsychosocial model, health psychologists, if I look through journals over years, haven't paid a lot of attention to context. Let me say there is progress. I'm being sort of funny, but there isn't, but there is. We now at least see samples of different kinds of groups. It used to be sort of totally white men, you know, in the 70s. Now it's really, we've brought in gender. There are many more studies out on groups of sexual orientation, on SES has become a major variable now in health psychology. But I still think that much more of the work is found in public health and sociology, and what scares me more, even medical journals. Why are psychologists not doing this? I have 3 answers, because it's always 3, right? Unless it's Passover, and then I have a 4 analogy. Actually, it's getting close, right? I could have used that one. Okay. 1 that comes up. 1 is disciplinary boundaries. I think, and you know, as someone who runs a health psych training program, I think what happens is we are still sort of psychologists, even though everybody's supposed to be interdisciplinary, we're still psychologists, and we still think and read on the level of the individual. Certainly most of the articles I assign, most of the theories of health and illness behavior I assign, whether it's trans-theoretical model, it's Howard Levinthal's cognitive model, whatever it is, it's very individual. You know, I even talked to Howard about, you know, you've got the context in there and the others, but where are the studies of it? He goes, that one always gives me problems. So I think that's a good way to think. We just think about individuals, personality, individual outcomes. I'm guilty of this too. It's the training. But it's not everybody. Community psychologists, environmental psychologists can think about settings, can think about neighborhoods, can think about social norms, can think about political pressures. Why isn't this pervading health psychology? I'm not really sure, because as NIH screams at us more and more to become interdisciplinary, we should be sort of picking it. It should be easier to do and picking it up, but we're not. And a lot of, as a journal editor and as someone who submits articles, I can see how reviewers have trouble with things that aren't individual. They question validity. They question, well, what does it really mean to be a community? How do you know you sampled the community? Just somewhat, you know, in health psychology, behavioral medicine, still staying on that sort of individual. A second thing is what's happened, and I guess, John, you're guilty because there was like a brain on my poster.
I didn't draw it.
There's been a move in psychology. As the wonderful growth of neuroscience has happened, there's been a real move again back toward biological determinism. Now that we can map the genes, now that we're really getting more of a sense of which part of the brain lights up. I still don't know if people understand the processes, but they can tell you what lights up. We're moving again back to biology, which pulls us a bit away from the social context, because it would just be so much easier to tweak a gene or to give a medication that created a lock, you know, that changed something. And so I think it's really hard for us as health psychologists to be experts sort of both on this end, the sociocultural context, and this end, the biological context. And I don't have to do that, but my students do in some ways. That's where it is now. And I think that's a lot harder. And we have, I actually will say, I actually think some of the best research in psychology is more biological. Alyssa Appel's work on stress and telomere breakage is just brilliant. Jan Kiko-Glazer's work on interpersonal stress and marital stress and wound healing. This is really, to me, going across levels analysis and looking at interpersonal phenomena and chronic stress, you know, at the biological, psychological, and sociological levels. So I think that it can be good, but it's starting to have us run back to this sort of magic bullet that was the biological, the biomedical model. And that was why we came up with the biopsychosocial model. It's not enough. And I feel sometimes we're running back to, if we can say it's a process in the brain or an enzyme or something, then we don't have to deal with our social conditions. The third issue, is methodological blinders. And I think it's getting better with our younger generation. We were all trained in a certain level of methods. So my students are running statistics I don't understand. It is getting better in some sense. We're able to really answer questions in a better way. But sometimes we just put on blinders as we get older and say, I don't want to do this other stuff. This is good enough. And I think we have to start moving across methodological traditions. Again, I see some of my students doing this well. They can move between qualitative and quantitative research very fluidly. But then I look at journal reviews, and I have doctors saying this is qualitative research, yuck, or I'm even someone who says it's not enough, or this is a huge epidemiological study where you've controlled everything. Okay, so my biggest beef, and the article that I wrote that started this is called All Things Are Not Equal, it started to get to me when people would control for gender. Let's pretend as if they're all the same gender. They're all the same SES. They're all the same ethnicity. So I think part of it is we have to come to a different set of methods where instead of controlling for these things, we actually put them into the model and look at interactions and say it's not just about coping, it's about does gender influence coping? Does SES affect coping versus I want to control for it? Still bothers me 30 years later. So how can we resolve these dilemmas? Let me leave you with a couple of guidelines so you don't just feel like, ugh, the end of the world in health psychology. All right, one of them, and they're big guidelines, but they actually work in some sense. So one of them is make context a part of your daily vocabulary. I don't know what you all study. Whatever you study on the way home tonight, think about it in terms of context. Don't change your dissertation. Don't change your study right now. But think about what would help me answer the questions more about group differences or about why this leads to this or someone's not adhering. Think a little bit more in terms of context. If you had a much bigger grant or a grant, what would you want to study? And I'm suggesting you do this when you start to think about studies. Too often it comes in at the methods variable level. It's really about a theory. Is your theory relevant to a particular population? Does the theory beg for bringing in a contextual variable like SES? A second thing is, now I'm going to tell you, I told you to like go broad here, now like an accordion pull in. Only include in your studies contextual variables that are relevant, theoretically relevant to your research questions. As some of my critics have pointed out, putting too many contextual variables in becomes cumbersome, not just for statistics, but for understanding things. We've all seen those path diagrams that look like Arlo Guthrie's, the circles and boxes in the diagram. And my students who, I'll do this, I love this, I want context, and all of a sudden there's a study with about 37 variables and arrows that are all pointing at each other. So even though I'm saying go broad, you also have to say, in this study, what's my best bet? What might be theoretically linked that it makes sense to bring in this contextual variable and not think I have to bring in everything? Include constructs and mechanisms that are greater than individual level attributes, particularly if the phenomenon you're talking about is at a greater level than the individual. So if we're talking about the way culture and advertising affect smoking, think about putting in larger variables and not just individual beliefs or habits. So think again about the larger context. And conduct research in vivo whenever possible. This is my frustration again with so many analog studies, including the one I gave you, in the lab that then don't go to the next step and says, does this really happen in real life? I feel it's really valuable to do proof of concept studies, but then we have to move out. And I have an article coming out in Health Psych it's a special issue on social psychology and health, where there are 5 major leading people who argue about their area that health psychology has never thought about it. The one that really got me was the one about, quote, affiliation science in health, that said health psychologists never studied social relationships. So I was asked to write one of the commentaries, which is called Lost in Translation. But it's the notion of we have to go past these proof of concept studies in labs with college students to people who have risk behaviors, who live in risky communities, and take it out there. So in my 30 years, if I can leave you with a piece of advice, I've learned to focus instead on what Carl Weick referred to as small wins. Incremental social change, incremental change in the field of psychology. None of our studies is going to solve a problem, but they add little bits, little pieces to the puzzles. I think it's only when we begin to even partially understand those mediating or intervening mechanisms, not just a group difference, not just a correlation, that we're going to really be able to start to design culturally anchored and contextually anchored health interventions. I think it's really important if we can recognize in the articles that we read and the studies we all design when we've left out an important part of context. So I'm going to leave you with one anecdote. A study I was involved in, I was called in as a consultant. The PI had done a major smoking cessation trial. And she wanted to know, when she sat me down, she said, I want to know why African American, she said African American failed her intervention at a greater rate than white women or than white or African American men. And I said, failed, was there a test? And she said, well, they dropped out of the study. Could you do a qualitative study and find out why? And I'm not a qualitative researcher, so I have no clue why she asked me to do this, but I thought, good, time to learn. So I did this. So we used focus groups and individual interviews. So we went back to all all the women in the study, not just those that had dropped out, black women, white women, dropped out, finished it through. And the way I did it was actually Michelle Fine, my colleague, who sort of suggested I do this, who's a TC alum, who said, show them the data in pictorial form. So I use sort of the census stick figures, men and women with skirts and whatever, to show sort of the number of people in each of those groups who had dropped out, and said, why do you think why? And what came out from this was that most of the black women who had failed, meaning who had dropped out, didn't understand that the study protocol meant if they smoked even one puff of a cigarette, they were out. If they missed one of the counseling sessions, they were out of the study. If they didn't take the if they didn't use the Zyban patch for one day, they were out of the study. And they'd get these calls saying, you're out of the study. So they were actually incredibly angry, which I was not expecting. They were really outraged about the way they had treated, because they had joined an intervention, they wanted to stop smoking. Black women also experience more physical side effects from Zyban. The patches don't work as well, which led to their non-adherence. But that never came up in the quantitative data. So these data really led me to wonder, had these women failed the program, or had the program failed the women? Because context, their life context, had not been taken into account when designing the trial, the intervention was very ineffective for a particular group, and that group got blamed. So I think if we're going to be able to develop viable health interventions, we really have to understand how context affects health. I think it's got to become basic science. Context is always over there. I think basic science has to talk about context. So now, 30 years into this game, I'm still very bewitched and bewildered about how context yields its effects. And I hope that by now you are too, and that the research you do next time will have a little bit more of context in it, and you're convinced context matters. Thanks.